Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's me. Welcome back to another video about game design, and this time we are going to talk about volatiles. This is a concept that was introduced in my last video, and apparently not everybody watched that one or remembered everything, because now I have to explain what volatiles are again. But fear not, this will be a very brief introduction before diving straight into the meat and potatoes of this topic. So if you haven't seen my previous video yet, then make sure to check it out when you're done here. I think that mastering monster mechanics is a fundamental skill for any game developer who wants to create a great game. Creating fun monsters is all about balancing volatiles. If you master this skill, your players will remember your game forever. If you don't, well, they will probably still remember your game, but maybe not for the right reasons. In this series, we explore how to create memorable monsters by focusing on the volatile triangle. That is how the concepts of might, speed, and intelligence affect each other, and how we can use these concepts to create unique, interesting, and fun monsters. In this second episode, we will dive into the topic of volatiles. What is a volatile? How do we utilize volatiles to make our monsters more interesting? Most importantly, how do we balance them? Now to recap, in my first video, we defined the three main attributes that determine how a monster feels to play against. These are might, speed, and intelligence. Might defines the power of the monster's attacks. Speed determines how quickly the monster can act and react, and intelligence defines how well the monster can utilize its might and speed. When we combine different levels of might, speed, and intelligence, we get a certain feel, or volatile, for the monster. High speed and high intelligence monsters feel very unpredictable and chaotic. High might and high intelligence monsters feel oppressive and calculated. High speed and high might monsters feel overwhelming and aggressive. Finally, low speed and low intelligence monsters feel weak and pathetic. Now, if you want to go even deeper, you can take two volatiles and combine them by assigning one volatile to the monster's normal form and another to its powered up or enraged form. For example, a monster could be slow and weak in its normal form, but fast and powerful when enraged. Or it could be highly intelligent and elusive in its normal form, and stupid and bulky when enraged. By mastering volatiles, we can create monsters with very distinct feels, from cute and quirky to downright terrifying. But there's more. We can also use volatiles to determine how a monster behaves. Think about it, okay? A monster that is both strong and intelligent will behave differently than a monster that is just strong. The intelligent monster will use its environment. It will try to pick better spots for ambushes, and it will also try to avoid fights if it is too risky for it. On the other hand, a strong but not so bright monster will charge into battle recklessly. It will and use the environment to its advantage, and it will probably die sooner than the intelligent monster. And this is where the real power of the volatile triangle comes from. You can use it to define how your monster behaves in battle and therefore tell a story through enemy design. So you might ask, why would anybody design a monster that is weak and unintelligent? Well, believe it or not, there's actually a reason for this. And no, it's not just to pad the early game with easy enemies. Weak and unintelligent monsters are very useful to teach the player the basics of the game. They are the perfect training dummies that allow the player to learn basic combat mechanics without dying to cheap tricks or overpowered attacks. Also, sometimes the challenge of fighting a really powerful monster can be more fun than the fight itself. After all, defeating a boss is very satisfying. But learning how to defeat that boss is even more satisfying. Of course, I'm not saying that all weak and unintelligent monsters should be like this. There's always room for creativity. For example, a monster could be slow and weak, but have some kind of special attack that catches the player off guard. Or it could be weak and unintelligent, but rely on numbers to overwhelm the player. Or it could be completely harmless, but incredibly annoying. Like, imagine a little worm that is very weak, but keeps regenerating its health bar or summoning more of its kind. But let's move on to something more interesting. What if we want to design a fast and intelligent monster? Well, we already know that these monsters feel unpredictable and chaotic to play against, but how can we make them even more interesting? One way is to give them some kind of special ability that allows them to dodge attacks at will. This will add a layer of difficulty to the fight because the player will need to adapt to these dodges. For example, a simple strategy of spamming sword attacks will not work anymore because the monster will simply dodge them. The player will need to mix it up, maybe throw some grenades, call the cavalry, use the environment, and so on. Of course, the monster can't be dodging all the time, otherwise the fight would become impossible, so we need to limit these dodges somehow. We can achieve this by giving the monster a vulnerability that cancels out its special ability. For example, maybe the monster's dodges can be interrupted by area of effect attacks like grenades or magic spells. This will create an interesting rock, paper, scissors type of relationship between the player's abilities and the monster's defenses. And this is exactly the kind of depth that makes a monster feel unpredictable and fun to fight. Now, what if we want to design a strong and intelligent monster? Well, this is where things get interesting, because there's multiple ways to approach this. The most straightforward method is to make the monster very tanky and give it powerful, targeted attacks. However, we already know that this will feel oppressive and boring to play against. So if we want to make it fun, we will need to find a way to make it less straightforward. One way to achieve this is to give the monster a resource that it needs to consume in order to use its powerful attacks. By doing this, we add a cost to the monster's offense, and we force the player to react to this. For example, maybe the monster consumes health in order to power up its attacks, or maybe it consumes mana instead. By doing this, we create a lot more depth in the fight, because now the player needs to react to these changes. If the monster is losing health, the player can go for the kill. If the monster is powering up its attacks, the player will need to defend itself. And if the monster is running out of mana, the player can punish it. And this is exactly the kind of depth that makes a monster feel oppressive and fun to fight. And what about a fast and powerful monster? Well, this is probably the trickiest combination because a monster that is both fast and powerful will feel overwhelming and aggressive very quickly. So if we want to make this combination fun, we will need to limit the monster's strengths and exploit its weaknesses. One way to do this is to give the monster very high base stats, but extremely poor intelligence. This will make the monster act very erratically and give the player an opportunity to punish these mistakes. Another method is to give the monster average stats, but allow it to buff itself. This will make the monster much more dangerous, and the player will need to react to these buffs. For example, the monster could increase its own damage, gain armor, or even heal itself. This will require the player to interrupt the monster's buffs in order to succeed, and this will add a lot of depth to the fight. Finally, we could also give the monster very high stats, but allow it to enter a rage state that lowers its intelligence. This will make the monster very powerful, but also very reckless, and the player will need to adapt to these changes. There's many ways to balance volatiles, and the best method depends on the situation. My advice is to start with a powerful monster that is dumb enough to make mistakes, and then gradually make it smarter until it becomes a challenging but not infuriating opponent. And this is where the volatile triangle really shines. By mastering the volatile triangle, we can create monsters with distinct feels and behaviors, which in turn creates unforgettable gaming experiences. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video.